With the King heading to Washington tomorrow, though, first of all, will the government take extra steps to tighten his security?
Well, look, as you'd imagine, the government and the palace were in close cooperation with American counterparts in advance of the visit anyway, and further discussions will be taking place today ahead of next week.
So there may be some step-ups in what was planned?
There'll be appropriate security in place in relation to the risk, yeah.
The whole visit, though, is taking place in a very, very tense atmosphere. Donald Trump has been relentlessly criticising Sir Keir Starmer on TV, on social media. Would it be helpful for you if the King told him to back off a bit?
The King and the President have a very warm relationship, which I think is reflected in lots of different ways between the United States and the United Kingdom. In relation to the pressure from the President on our Prime Minister, Keir's been very clear that he interprets that as the President trying to pressure him about his involvement in the war in the Middle East. And this government's been very clear that it's not our war. We're not going to be getting involved in that way.
But it's a bit more than that, though, isn't it? I mean, he said, I don't think he has a chance. If his policies become strong, which they're not, he can recover. But if he doesn't, I don't think he has a chance. I mean, is part of this visit for the King to have a bit of a quiet word and try and pull him back a bit?
Well, look, the King is visiting to recognise the 250th year of independence. Our relationship started with a disagreement and yet has been a strong relationship for hundreds of years ever since. And there are often political disagreements between administrations, but the relationship that is pretty well bonded between the United States and the United Kingdom, both in terms of culture, language, families, business, all the way through to military and intelligence cooperation is pretty deep.
But he's not just going to go and mark that anniversary. We all know that. Keir Starmer sat and dangled the invitation to him in front of the cameras in the Oval Office. It's a political motivation too, because it seems that Donald Trump is very charmed by the monarchy. So is he going to be helping you out by trying to warm things up a bit, trying to soothe things?
So look, His Majesty will always act in the interest of Britain. There's no question about that. And it's good that the King has that type of relationship with the President.
Will he tell Donald Trump that it would be a mistake to look again at Britain's relationship with the Falklands, as a Pentagon email seems to have suggested, which was leaked this week?
So look, I obviously can't predict what His Majesty will say in a private meeting with the President, but in relation to the Falklands, the government position is very clear. The Falklands is British territory, and the only people that get to decide otherwise are the islanders themselves. But
it does sound like you hope that the King's visit might change some of the dynamics a bit. You've been emphasising the warmth between the two and that it would be in the UK's interests.
Diplomacy is diplomacy, whether it's from His Majesty the King, the Prime Minister or our diplomats.
And after the mess over Peter Mandelson, how important is it that the relationship is improved?
I'm not quite sure how the two are connected in terms of the domestic debate and the international relationship. I think the new ambassador
because if you look at what's happening in this country from other parts in the world, you think it looks incredibly messy and you look like a Prime Minister who's in deep trouble in his own party.
Look, I'll be frank. Actually, I've been abroad recently, and I also had a constituency town hall in my own constituency yesterday with 150 people, 2 hours. Peter Mandelson didn't come up once. I mean, there are legitimate questions here around process failings. It's right that Parliament looks at that. But when I was abroad, when I was with members of the public here in the UK, people are more worried about the impact of the Middle East on their energy bills, about the functioning of the National Health Service, about giving their children or grandchildren the best start in life. It wasn't raised once with me about the UK security vetting process. So whilst there's legitimate questions there to be answered, I think we have to recognise that opposition parties now are using this, which has been clearly shown to not be a case for the Prime Minister to have to answer as a pre-election kind of tactic.
But most absolutely rightly, you can understand that most people are much more worried about what's happening in their own lives, but that's exactly why this is such a mess, because the handling of this is sucking up government time, effort and energy, because the opposition parties claim again and again, and the Prime Minister has admitted he got this very badly wrong. So let's just briefly touch on some of the process, because as you say, there are legitimate questions. You said the way Peter Mandelson got the job, even though there were security concerns, had serious process failings. There's your words there.
Yep.
But the boss of the Cabinet Office, which is your department, said, my view is that the due process was followed. So which is it?
Well, my comments were in relation to the fact that officials had seen that UK security vetting recommended not to appoint Peter Mandelson and didn't feel it necessary to tell ministers. That, as far as I'm concerned, is a serious process failing.
But then the most senior official in your own department is saying that the process was followed. So those two things
I think
don't quite stack up today.
But these quotes are in the context of slightly broader or more narrow debates. I think what my permanent secretary was talking about was that the established process from appointment to security vetting, the fact that in a business as usual appointment, security recommendations are not given to ministers. But this was a different set of circumstances. This was a political appointment of Peter Mandelson to be the ambassador to the United States.
Isn't that exactly the point,
Those issues should have been raised.
This is not about process. And while Westminster loves talking about process, this is about a grave error of political judgment on the part of the Prime Minister. Do you accept that?
I think there are some key points here. First is the Prime Minister has himself acknowledged that he shouldn't have appointed Peter Mandelson. He's apologised for that. Yes, there are process questions, but actually the evidence of Sir Ollie Robbins, the questions that have been answered in the House in the past week, have made it crystal clear that when the Conservatives and other parties accuse the Prime Minister of lying or misleading the House, that is just not true. There is no evidence of that. And then you have to ask the question, why? To your question, why do the opposition keep trying to find new process points? It's because we're in a pre-election period.
We'll talk to the opposition in a few minutes' time.
That's why they're doing that.
But sticking with what went wrong here, what Ollie Robbins, the former boss of the civil service end of the Foreign Office, who was sacked, even though, as your permanent secretary said, he'd followed the due process, he said that there was clear political pressure to get that appointment done. And that is about the political judgment of this operation. Do you accept, again, this is much more about political judgment than it is about any of the process minutiae?
We're not arguing about the judgment because the Prime Minister said he made the wrong call. He's apologised for it. No one's trying to defend that decision. So that's kind of been put to bed. You then move to these process points, which, as I say, have been dealt with this week.
Did you send Peter Mandelson what was described as a warm message on the day that he was sacked, as has been reported?
No, I was asked what was going on in Downing Street. I think
by him?
Yes. This was the week that I had just arrived as Chief Secretary. I don't think I even had an office at the time. And I replied along the lines of, I don't know what's happening. I'm not in the room. I'm sorry it all seems so difficult. And that was the exchange that I think has been referred to in
so you said,
piece.
I'm sorry it was so difficult, but you wouldn't describe what you said as a warm message.
I wouldn't say it was warm and I didn't know what was taking place. I just felt that it was difficult at the time for everybody involved.
The point about all of this, though, more broadly, is that the Prime Minister can't seem to move on from this row. The opposition parties are still asking questions. There are still documents that haven't been published, even though Parliament said that all the documents had to come out there into the public domain. And the Prime Minister seems to keep sacking people for his mistake. That's not a good look, is it?
Well, firstly, on the documents being published, they will all be published. The reason they've not been published yet is because part of the process is they have to go through a committee in Parliament before they can be published publicly, and that process hasn't completed yet, and it's important that we do that. But all those documents will be published because there is nothing to hide here. But you're right, it's frustrating when there's so much time being spent on this, especially in a week when the Renters' Rights Act has come in to protect people in insecure housing. The Employment Rights Act is supporting vulnerable people on zero-hours contracts. The NHS waiting lists are down to the lowest in 3 years. We've even seen government borrowing falling, and we're having to put a lot of work in now to try to understand the impacts of war in the Middle East for people here in the UK.
And we'll come to that in a second.
And that's the work that government is focusing on.
We'll come to that in a second, because that really matters to people watching. But the opposition parties want there to be an investigation by a powerful watchdog in Westminster. It's called the Privileges Committee. There could be a vote on that in Parliament this week. Why not just say yes to that, so there can be a full investigation, you can draw a line under it, everything can come out into the public domain, and then move on?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, firstly, it's the Speaker's discretion as to whether there's an investigation of that nature.
So would you welcome it?
I know he will take these situations seriously. But you have to look at the case that the opposition are putting. They're putting forward a case about a small change in language between that and any pressure. You have to remember, what are these privileges committees about? The last time it was used was when Boris Johnson told the House of Commons there were no parties in Downing Street. It was then shown he was at 5 of them and got a fine from the police. That's what these processes are in place for. So the opposition are just using tactics to try to distract from the fact that the government is doing good work in this pre-election period, trying to deliver on a whole range of issues to support people across the country.
But there still are differing interpretations of exactly what happened. So wouldn't it be the right thing just to have it, say, fine, investigate it, be completely scrupulous?
But what are the interpretations? I don't think there are.
Well, the opposition party, we'll talk to them in a second, but would you try and block this happening? Would you tell your MPs to vote against it?
They've got to lay their case, but as far as I understand the case, there is no case to answer here, and they're just playing silly games.
So would you tell Labour MPs to vote against it?
it's a decision for the Speaker. It's for him that needs to decide whether this is something that goes ahead or not.
OK. Do you want to apologise to Labour activists who are trying to campaign when the centre of government is in such a mess? One of your colleagues said to me this week, it is impossible for us to make an argument when the news agenda has been dominated by the Mandelson mess.
Yeah, look, I mean, I get that that's frustrating. I've been campaigning.
Say sorry to them?
Well, I've been campaigning all across the country with colleagues, and I know how hard that they're fighting in these midterm elections. And I know that the May elections are going to be difficult for the party. After a run of 4 or 5 years on the upside of the curve, you know, people know that these are going to be challenging. And this latest round of issues has made that slightly harder. The one thing I would say, though, as I said, I was particularly taken yesterday on the doors in South Wales, in my own constituency, with hundreds of constituents who could ask me a question about anything they wanted over the course of 2 hours. Not one person mentioned this, not one. What they're really interested in is what this Labour government is doing to improve public services and improve their quality of living. And
that people are finding it very tough right now. And things might get harder as the conflict in Iran seems to be unresolved. There aren't any talks going on. We know that government is trying to prepare for the worst, but can you be really upfront about the kind of problems that we might face? Might there be gaps on supermarket shelves in the coming months, for example?
So we've started to look at this in a lot of detail inside government. I chair this process on behalf of the Prime Minister. There is no denying there's going to be some economic impact as a consequence of what's happened in the Middle East. We're seeing that already. Inflation had gone up as opposed to down. That was driven predominantly by energy bills because of the blockade on energy coming out of the Middle East. We have been working through systematically different potential points of pressure, from jet fuel to diesel to carbon dioxide and other processes, to make sure that we have sight of whether, if there is a supply problem, what can we do to fix that? And if there are price pressure, which is likely to be the most relevant impact for us in the UK, what can we do to help?
But in terms then of those specifics that you're looking at, just a couple of questions I think people would really welcome you being upfront. Is it possible we'll see gaps on supermarket shelves?
At the moment, it looks like it's more in relation to things like potential availability of some energy supplies going into production. So it's more of a price pressure. You're going to see prices go up a bit as a consequence of what Donald Trump has done in the Middle East. And quite frankly, that's probably going to come online not just in the next few weeks, but the next few months. There's going to be a long tail from this.
So how long, that was actually going to be my last question to you, for how long do you think this pressure is going to be sustained? And for how long might petrol prices be higher, for example?
It really depends on how long the negotiations take to unblock the Strait of Hormuz and bring a de-escalation to the conflict in the Middle East.
There's no sign of that happening. So we're talking months, right?
I think our best guess is 8+ months from the point of resolution that you'll see economic impacts coming through the system.
So 8 months after the end of this mess in the Middle East.
So people will see higher energy prices, food prices and those types of issues, flight ticket prices, as a consequence of what Donald Trump has done in the Middle East. The government here in the UK, the work that I'm doing with the Prime Minister, is looking at all of those things and saying, what can we do within our power to help people to get through those difficult times?
And just briefly, is there really a beer committee to make sure that pints don't run dry during the World Cup?
So I raised this issue because if there is a problem with jet fuel on holidays and carbon dioxide on beer, the summer might be pretty depressing for people. But we're doing everything we can to make sure that is not the case. I'm
sure plenty of people will be watching will be relieved to hear that. Cabinet Minister Darren Jones, thanks very much indeed for coming in.